Understanding Thatcher's economics policies is quite a challenge because of some of the terminology that's associated with it, which makes it does make it difficult. But if we understand Thatcher's economic policies, then it really facilitates an understanding of the other strands of Thatcherism, her rolling back the state, her political divisions, and also the social division and the growing inequality in Britain in the 1980s. And we really need to get to grips with the fact that her economic policy and her strategy was not consistent from 1979 until 1990. It's divided into these two periods, starting with monetarism, which she largely abandons by the mid 1980s, and then she switches to supply side economics. And this isn't a definite date, 1983. It's more that it's phased out and it's moved to this idea of supply side economics. To understand Margaret Thatcher's economic policies, though, I'm going to put these four strands. We're going to think of them as the four pillars of Margaret Thatcher's economic strategy. And we think about the basis of her economic approach. Much of it was based in the Chicago School of Economics, which is why we're going to see a lot of crossover between Thatcher's economic policies and also what was happening in America under Reagan. One of the key theorists behind this is someone called Milton Friedman. It is definitely, though, a rejection of what was going on in the post-war era. So the dominant economic strategy from 1945 through to the mid to late 1970s is Keynesian economics. So that's a lot of government intervention and there's a focus on unemployment. And Margaret Thatcher is thoroughly rejecting Keynesian economics. So I've taken these four strands and they are there at the top, and we need to understand what those keywords actually mean. So what I want you to do is think, how can I use those phrases underneath direct taxation, interest rates, unemployment, how can I use them to help explain the core terms in the boxes above? So you might want to just stop the video at this point and see if you can have a go. Just try matching those phrases, those 9 phrases, try and match some of them with the core key phrases above: supply side economics, popular capitalism, monetarism, and deregulation. So I've taken here monetarism. What would we link monetarism in? Well, hopefully you would have linked it firstly with inflation, because the purpose of monetarism, monetarist economic policy, was to control inflation. And that's why it's a rejection of Keynesian economics. Keynesian economics was about controlling unemployment. Monetarism is not. It's about how do we control rising inflation, which was the key economic problem of the 1970s. And the technique, the tool that they're going to use to control inflation is interest rates, because the idea about monetarism was that they thought the cause of inflation was too much money in circulation. So if we're going to try and reduce the amount of money in circulation, we're going to put up interest rates. So people are going to put the money in the bank. So that should hopefully reduce the amount of money in circulation. But it also means big spending cuts. And that's the other aspect of Thatcher's economic strategy in the early 1980s. But a consequence of that, if there are high interest rates, it makes it very difficult for businesses to get loans, to invest in their companies. And if we've got spending cuts as well, the consequence of that was that there was rising unemployment. But that's not what Margaret Thatcher is concerned about, unemployment. So when it peaks at 3 million, that's not her primary goal, it's inflation. So that's why she doesn't roll back from monetarism, even when unemployment is, like it was in Liverpool, it was about 25%. The second aspect of Margaret Thatcher's economic policy was supply side economics. So this is the change in emphasis that's happening in the mid-1980s. So this is about creating demand and controlling supply. And the first way that Margaret Thatcher does this is she alters the taxation brackets. So she cuts the top rate of income tax to try and stimulate supply and demand. But of course, if you've got less money coming into the treasury, you need to find it from somewhere. So to balance that up, she put up indirect taxation. So things like VAT, value added tax, went up. So we also need to understand the difference between regressive and progressive taxes. So if you have, if high income earners have high levels of taxation and it's redistributed so that the poorer members of society pay less tax, that is a progressive tax. It's relative to your income. Indirect taxation, like VAT, was just a standard percentage. So it didn't matter how much wealth you had, you paid exactly the same amount. So that would seem to be somewhat unfair on lower incomes, and therefore it's known as a regressive tax. Also, to stimulate demand, she also relaxed the rules around credit. So it became far easier to get credit cards. Next one, popular capitalism. So you should have linked privatisation with this. This is the idea that she took nationalised industries and privatised them and allowed people to buy shares in those companies. And finally, we've also got deregulation. So this was the Big Bang, happens in October 1986, where she took away a lot of the rules and regulations about the stock exchange and made London the financial capital of the world. So if we think about the impact, I've put these three images on here to show that there is a really big regional and class impact on Thatcher's policies. So we get the rise of this group on the left. They were called the Yuppies, young, upwardly mobile, tended to be working in the financial services industry. But also as part of deregulation, she clamped down on the trade unions. So they suffered under Margaret Thatcher, and also industrial areas as well, because she said she is no longer going to prop up companies that were no longer viable. And she also transform the economy from a more manufacturing base and made it into a service economy. So we get this rebalancing of the economy. So how do we link Thatcher's economic strategy with historical interpretations? Because that's what this paper is about, interpretations of Margaret Thatcher. And I really like this quote by E.H. Carr because it helps us understand why people might have different interpretations about Thatcher's economic policy. Historical facts are like fish swimming about in a vast and inaccessible ocean. And what the historian catches will depend partly on chance, but mainly on what part of the ocean he chooses to fish in and what tackle he chooses to use. These two factors being, of course, determined by the kind of fish he wants to catch. So, when we evaluate Margaret Thatcher's economic strategy, we have to think, well, what time period are we looking at? Are we looking at the monetarist time period? Are we looking at the whole time period? Did she maintain her success? Was it there in the long term? Also, how are we evaluating her success? Are we judging her by her own objectives? Or are we evaluating them in terms of the impact of her economic policies on different groups in society? Because if I choose also to think about inflation figures, then I might say, well, yeah, she had a lot of success. But if I then look at unemployment figures, it would suggest she didn't have that much success. So the historian will reach different conclusions based on the evidence that they are grabbing out of that ocean. So finally, we've got four different possible interpretations that you could reach about Thatcher's economic strategy. These aren't real ones, I've just made them up. But you might also just want to stop the video here and just finish off these sentences. How could you construct an interpretation to support these opening sentences? So if we have a look at the green box, well, if I wanted to say that Thatcher's economic strategy was a total success as a historian, I might say, well, yep, she controlled inflation, she liberated the economy, she promoted self-help and creativity. So I'm just picking out all the positives there. But that is a valid interpretation, it's evidence-based, it's just I've got a very narrow focus. The orange and the yellow I would describe as my sit on the fence type of interpretations. So Thatcher's economic strategy was a success primarily, but I might say, yes, she did control inflation, but it went back up by 1990. And I'm kind of pointing to the fact that there are regional differences in her success. And then here, this interpretation is kind of emphasizing more of the failure, saying she did rebalance the economy. But if I looked at the data about balance of payments and unemployment, that compares unfavorably. And finally, this grey one, total failure. Well, for this, I could pick out some evidence about unemployment, it topping 3 million, and also a lot of the data about the comparative data about Britain and her relative economic decline is not very favourable. Britain continues to fall behind other European nations.